Hey everyone, this is a piece by Alan Johnson. It says it was put on the Alliance for Workers' Liberty website in 2018, but I don't know exactly if that means like when it was written. Um, so here we go. Um, in Defense of Ernest Erber by Alan Johnson. Quote, Russia was ruled by 130,000 landowners. The landowner is ruled by means of constant force over 150 million people. Dot dot dot. Yet we are told that Russia will not be able to be governed by 240,000 members of the Bolshevik Party, governing in the interests of the poor and against the rich. End quote. Vladimir Lenin. Will the Bolsheviks retain state power? In 1948, after he spent a year thinking it over, Ernest Erber submitted an 18,000-word resignation letter to the U.S. Workers' Party, a small group of mostly young, mostly Jewish, one early internal bulletin carried the subhead, quote, out to the Gentiles, end quote, and most brilliantly revolutionary socialists. The most brilliant of all, the group's leader, Max Shachtman, responded angrily to Erber in an 80,000-word polemic titled Under the Banner of Marxism. 70 years later, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty has reprinted this document, calling it, quote, one of the classic polemics of the Marxist movement, alongside the poverty of philosophy and anti-Düring, end quote. I take a different view. Erber was right and Shachtman was wrong about the fundamental thing, Bolshevism and us. He was right to say, quote, it is necessary to reject the Leninist teachings on the relationship of democracy to socialism, end quote. He was right that, quote, the workers, bracket, in the West, end bracket, are right in identifying their aims with the preservation and extension of those democratic processes and institutions that already exist, end quote. And, not discussed here, he was also right that socialists, quote, for the sake of civilization, specifically the socialist perspective, end quote, should not be neutral, but should side with democracy against totalitarianism when the socialist third camp can't offer a genuine alternative. New section. 1. Erber was right about Bolshevism. Erber's critique is more subtle than Shachtman admits. Far from being a right-wing denunciation of revolution, Erber's concern is the gulf between Bolshevik intentions and Bolshevik results. Erber's subject is not a group of bad men, but the disastrous logic of, quote, Lenin's revision of the traditional Marxist concept of the relationship of democracy to socialism in favor of the anti-democratic view of the party ruling on behalf of the masses, end quote. Erber pays homage to the Bolsheviks, but argues that, quote, the course the Bolsheviks chose had a terrible logic of its own, end quote, and, quote, could not be traversed without the suppression of the socialist opposition, the check of terror, one-man management of the factories, compulsory labor. They are all fatal links in a chain that began with Lenin's revision, end quote. Ernest Erber. Most of what passes for education in the far left about the Bolsheviks is a fairy tale. Erber told some inconvenient truths. That Bolshevik practice after October was an authoritarian travesty of socialism, that before the Civil War, non-Bolshevik socialists were being censored, persecuted, jailed, tortured, and sometimes shot, that trade unionists who struck or voted Menshevik or just insisted on organizing independently of the Bolsheviks were being sacked and jailed, exiled, or shot, that the Constituent Assembly, elected by the people, but with a non-Bolshevik majority, was forcibly shut down, that the Soviets were gutted by the Bolsheviks as soon as they started electing non-Bolshevik majorities, that some Soviets electing Mensheviks were revisited by the Cheka, that some Soviets electing Mensheviks were visited by the Cheka, that the Cheka was an out-of-control disgrace to socialism from its first days, and that the Bolshevik culture of lying about other socialists and about troublesome workers, some of which Shachtman repeats, began early. Ernest Erber also saw that the Bolsheviks, like Lenin, Trotsky, Bukharin, and Stalin, revised Marxist theory to justify their own authoritarian practice, and then educated the international socialist movement in this new brutalism. Socialism was unmoored by them from democracy and liberty. Belief in the fantastical qualities of transformative revolutionary violence and central command was promoted, not least by Trotsky, who for several years was a flat-out and in-principle authoritarian. It's funny because I just read today the piece by Ian MacKay. He doesn't have the same political background as Alan Johnson, but he comes from coming from actually an anarchist communist background, and this is kind of the point of his whole thing. He calls the Trotskyist. It's a piece called "The Trotskyist Movement: Bureaucracy and Exile." The international movement was taught to substitute a totalitarian doppelganger for Marx's and Engels' democratic version of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. The fruits of centuries of working class struggle, those civilizational gains of liberty, rights and representative democracy, which socialists should aspire to defend, extend, and make to work for all, were trashed in theory as well as practice. Shachtman's claim that, quote, Lenin's theory is nothing but a restatement of what Marx and Engels taught, end quote, is spectacularly, staggeringly wrong. According to Lenin, quote, the scientific term, quote, dictatorship means nothing more nor less than authority untrammeled by any laws. This is my emphasis. Untrammeled by any laws, absolutely unrestricted by any rules whatever, and based directly on force. The term, quote, dictatorship has no other meaning than this, end quote. The third camp socialist, Howard Draper, observed that Lenin's definition was a, quote, theoretical disaster. First class, bracket, with, and bracket, nothing in common, with any conception of the workers' state, end quote, held by Marx. More, that Plekhanov, Lenin, Trotsky, and Bukharin, in the manner of their counterposition of, quote, bourgeois and, quote, proletarian democracy, reduced democracy per se to, quote, bourgeois democracy, and flatly counterposed dictatorship to democracy. This had the consequence, this had the consequence of, Draper again, in parentheses, quote, gutting socialism of its organic enrootment in the mass of the people. When Stalin took another lead, the lead in organizing the socio-economic counter-revolution in class power, the, quote, juridical basis in theory, parenthesis, to use Trotsky's later expression, in parenthesis, had already been laid, end quote. New section, section 2. Erber was right about the relationship of mutual entailment that exists between democracy, liberty, and socialism. Erber may have lacked Shachtman's erudition, parenthesis, though I find Shachtman's unrelenting crude sarcasm repulsive, end parenthesis, but he knew a thing or two. Erber knew a thing or two. Erber knew that a party, even one full of the most talented and most selfless idealists who substitute themselves for a self-conscious majority, will produce a tyranny, no matter what. Never mind Lenin's 240,000 Bolsheviks. If every single one of Russia's few million proletarians had been Bolsheviks, and tried to rule over a population of 150 million, the result would have been the same. Erber knew that the institutional form of a socialist democracy is the democratic republic, albeit one freed of feudal leftovers, freed of the coercive, if indirect, economic power of the capitalist class, and deepened by new forms of participation. Erber knew that Lenin turned that formulation upside down by insisting, quote, the task of the proletariat consists in blowing up the whole machinery of the bourgeoisie, in destroying it, all the parliamentary institutions with it, whether they be republican or constitutional monarchy, end quote. Lenin did not just oppose limited franchises, unelected second chambers, and royal prerogatives, but the elective principle per se, the universal franchise, representative assemblies, i.e., elected parliaments and elected local councils, the rule of law, and the separation of powers between executive, legislature, and judiciary. Lenin declared for rule untrammeled by law, denounced, quote, all kinds of voting democracy and such like bourgeois deceit, end quote. Never took the Soviets seriously, within months they were being marginalized, their non-Bolshevik majorities ignored, and, if troubled, their delegates arrested, imprisoned, and exiled, In their place came dictatorial rule by the party state through its newly created and monopolized institutions. Soon enough, as a younger Trotsky, in his book, what the hell is that place called? Our Political Tasks, I believe it's called. It's from like 1903, I believe it's from. I think this is what's about to be referred to here. Soon enough, as a younger Trotsky in Luxembourg had predicted, the Bolshevik spanned opposition within the party, crushed the Kronstadt rebels, and lied about who they were and why they rebelled, and threatened party dissenters such as Alexander Kollontai and the workers' opposition until they shut up. Trotsky did not even oppose the first show trials of Mensheviks. Much of Shachtman's reply to Erber's critique of the record of the Bolsheviks is totally unserious. Shachtman dismissed the crushing of the working class and socialist Kronstadt rebels by the Bolsheviks in his jokesy, folksy way as, quote, stories by any number of people who weren't there, authenticity guaranteed or your money back, end quote. Shachtman swishes aside Lenin and Trotsky's explicit and in principle support for lawless dictatorship in the hands of the party as, quote, a selection of quotations from Lenin or Trotsky, end quote. Shachtman simply refuses to engage with the facts about the Cheka's appalling persecution of non-Bolshevik socialists and recalcitrant workers from the earliest days of the revolution, treating all charges in the manner of a cheap lawyer, quote, labels marked, quote, Cheka terror, quote, secret police, quote, suppression of socialists, all lithographed in scarlet to imitate bloodstains and scare children, end quote. It is desperate stuff. One second, I want to copy this quote down. Okay, sorry about that. Erber also knew the Bolsheviks were wrong to reduce modern representative democracy in the West to a, quote, bourgeois dictatorship, end quote, to be, quote, smashed. Erber knew socialism should be the continuation and deepening of the institutions and culture of representative liberal democracy. He pointed out that far from being a mere, quote, machine for the suppression of the working class, end quote, as Lenin had it, representative democracy was an arena of struggle which, quote, bears the marks of dozens of great social conflicts, end quote, has been, quote, nowhere was a political monopoly of the bourgeoisie, end quote, and toward which the working class is always oriented. Erber understood that the working class had constituted the democratic arena as it broke into it to win vital political and economic conquest. The vote, the right to organize and to strike, precious economic and social reforms to make its escape from numbing commodification and to civilize the whole society. The 8-hour day, the weekend, the welfare state, in parentheses. Lenin was completely wrong to claim that, quote, the parliament can in no way serve as the arena of a struggle for reforms for improving the lot of the working people, end quote. More, Erber knew that the Bolshevik hostile view of democracy, quote, creates a frame of mind in our movement which is alien to the workers of a political democracy and isolates us from them, end quote. His insight, quote, what is bourgeois about our present democracy is specifically its limitations, its shortcomings, and above all its exclusion from the economic sphere, end quote, is more useful than Lenin's talk of, quote, smashing representative democracy. Why does any of this matter today? Because what Rosa Luxemburg called, quote, barbarism is here, a world of grotesque inequality, rapid onset environmental collapse, technocratic governance, racism, and war. A new but inchoate left seeks to stand athwart A new but inchoate left seeks to stand, I think this might be a typo, to thwart this history as nightmare, yelling stop. Rather than Matt Gomna's uncritical hymn singing of, quote, glory, oh, to the Bolsheviks, end quote, that left really needs to hear Erber's call for socialists to, quote, reevaluate with an open and unprejudiced mind the many theories that have battled for acceptance in the past and check them anew against the experience of the past decades, end quote. That the Alliance Workers for Workers' Liberty has done more of that work of reevaluation than any other group over the last 4 decades is why it is the only UK far-left group that can still be taken seriously. But there is still a smell of incense in that airless room where, quote, glory, oh, glory to the Bolsheviks, end quote, is sung. Maybe it is time to open the windows. What need have you to dread the monstrous crying of the wind? New section, or maybe this is, maybe this isn't a section. This is just like maybe it's the end of the piece. But there's a thing at the bottom that says, Erber, Garris, and Bolshevism. Workers' Liberty is recently published In Defense of Bolshevism by Max Shachtman, in which the major text is a defense of the politics of Lenin, Trotsky, and the revolutionaries of 1917 against criticisms made by Ernest Erber. Erber had been a close comrade of Shachtman's in the Trotskyist movement in the late 1930s and the 1940s, but in 1948 broke away, and for the rest of his life was a sort of social democrat. In Solidarity 487, we published Alan Johnson's article on Norman Garris's Our Morals, The Ethics of Revolution, which develops many arguments, also reflected in Alan's article on Erber above. We'll be carrying replies from the point of view argued in the Defense of Bolshevism book. In later numbers of Solidarity, Norman Garris's article can be found here, and Leon Trotsky's Their Morals and Errors referred to in Garris's article here. And there's links. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.